Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Chris at Westminster.
It's Matt in the Newscast studio.
And it's Jane Green, also in the Newscast studio.
Hello to all of you. Right, let me just do the public service bit, which is to read out what's actually happening on Thursday. There are elections in 14 county councils, 8 unitary authorities, 1 metropolitan district, and there are 6 mayoral elections. And of course, there's the by-election in Runcorn. But even within the mayors, there's different types of mayors being elected, aren't there? Because we have this patchwork model of what a mayor is across England now.
Yeah, and there are some new mayors, inaugural mayoral elections, and then there's some mayoral elections that are being defended. And so where we have new mayors, there's even kind of less context and benchmarking to bring to bear to those elections as well. So we've got some brand new ones and some repeats.
And Chris, where would you say we are in the kind of like political cycle where these elections have landed?
We're in a conversation, picking up on what Jane was saying, where there is a question as we record now about how well do Reform do, how badly do the Conservatives and Labour do, and how well do the Liberal Democrats and the Greens do, and then throw in, because they're a sizable presence on various local authorities hither and thither, various independent groups as well. And then the other thing we've got to keep an eye out on is how the story progresses when we start getting the results, because we're used to, aren't we, on general election days or the night after a general election, you either stay up all night like saddos like us do, or you catch a bit of the exit poll and go to bed. But by the Friday morning, usually it's pretty clear what has happened. With local elections, that isn't the case. And what's going to happen next Friday is that we will wake up and we'll have found out what's happened in the by-election in Runcorn, what's happened in the mayoral race in Lincolnshire, both big prospects for reform. But much of the rest of the story, particularly where the Liberal Democrats may or may not be cheering in parts of southern England, for instance, and where we get a sense of how Conservatives and Labour and Greens and others have performed, we won't get a true sense of that till ticking towards Friday tea time. So there'll be a kind of election of two halves and two geographies going on, and with two potentially quite different kind of news lines emerging from them.
Yeah, because I remember in my old job when I was covering politics in the morning, we'd be covering one post-election story in the morning, and then I'd have my afternoon nap and I'd wake up and be like, oh, the story's different. Because Matt, you have to take the whole picture into account, not just the eye-catching thing that you get like at 7 o'clock in the morning.
And actually what's interesting is that there'll be lots to talk about what happened the last time these councils were up, which was 2021, post-vaccine bounce. Boris Johnson, there was that blimp in Hartlepool with the by-election, and he was very much riding high. We were coming out of the pandemic. People were happy with how he sort of handled it and getting the vaccine and all of that. And the results were bad. The Tories had won the Hartlepool by-election, which seemed very bad for Keir Starmer. And then the Tories...
We then learned that he considered resigning.
Various books as the day progressed, by the time you get into Saturday and Sunday, the results for Labour weren't as bad as they looked on the Friday morning. But the narrative about terrible result, because you get the by-election first and losing a seat in the House of Commons is worse than losing a seat on a county council. So the narrative was established. This was a really, really devastatingly bad night for Keir Starmer. And, by Sunday night, Monday morning, people say, well, actually, it is all to do with geography and which councils count when they count. And so it will take a long time. But to some extent, the maths matter less than the narrative. And if on Friday morning, Nigel Farage is in an open-top bus going between Lincolnshire and Runcorn on a sort of victory parade, that will set the narrative. If he doesn't win another county councillor, that sort of won't matter as much because he'll be there first. And so the geography of who's counting weirdly will shape the Westminster conversation.
Yes.
Regardless of who's running your local council.
So, Jane, move us off the idea of the narrative and get us onto the numbers. And as a professional election number cruncher, how do you crunch the numbers?
I kind of find, you're absolutely right to talk about how that story is going to unfold. And yet, everybody who's talking about it knows that's nonsense. So they know that actually, of course, the Tories are going to lose loads of councils because they did so well last time. Of course, these local elections are pretty much, for the largest part, a bit of a sort of catching up story from last year's general election, right? So they're going to confirm a load of things that we already knew. And those same people are going to know that the really interesting thing, the thing you really need to focus on, is the change in the share of the vote. And yes, still, I completely accept that is like not the real world. And the real world is that people will focus on seats won and seats lost and numbers and what Nigel Farage is saying and everyone else. And yet all of those people really also understand the electoral calculations, and they know that the really important thing is the change in share from last time. And the change in share in the national equivalent vote, or the projected national share.
And just explain the projected national share concept.
So what happens is you take these places. Now, we know that the places where the elections are being fought are not representative of the country as a whole. There's, many of these are rural areas, many of these are conservative areas. And we know that, Nigel Farage, of course, you made the point about these some of these were postponed and they might have been better for Nigel Farage. So you need to understand how the elections would look if they had been conducted across the country as a whole. And that's what that estimation is. So it's essentially, if we'd all been voting in these local elections, how would we have voted? With the caveat that there's still these local elections in this moment.
Not as if it was a general election.
And we know lots of things about how local elections tend to differ from how people vote in general elections. And so even then we've got to remember, if it were another local election, this is not a general election kind of a picture.
Matt, what was the point you wanted to make?
Well, isn't it the case that the projected vote share from the local elections last year was actually a better guide to the general election result than the polls?
But that was because they were a month earlier. Right, so
but actually, weren't they closer to what the result was than what the national polls?
Because
Labour were closer, weren't they? In the locals?
So a couple of things there. One is that we had these local elections in May last year, blindly unaware that we're about to go into a general election, right? So right before a general election, the local elections are going to be really predictive because not very much changed in that particular campaign. But also there was an overestimation of Labour's vote share in the polls and underestimation of the Conservative. And therefore, that was particularly useful. But there are patterns in local elections, for example, minor parties tending to do better, because obviously in a general election, we saw this it's very, very clear as anything that the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, so much tactical voting happened, so strategic voting to, essentially get out the Tories in the last general election, that you don't see the same vote shares for the Greens and the Liberal Democrats because people are looking in the first past the post system at alternative governments. So we know also that in these local elections, it's going to look like that fracturing, the fragmentation, the votes for the minor parties is going to look like a big story. And yet it's probably going to be amplified in locals.
Yeah. Chris, what's your take on just how all those parties have been fighting this campaign, like what they've tried to make it be about?
So let's. What order shall we go in? So from Labour's perspective, I think they are acutely aware, speaking to various folk privately, that when you're in government, things are pretty tricky when you get to local elections, even if the cycle, as Jane has been explaining, is one where Labour were in a pretty bleak place last time round, and the Conservatives were in a soaringly high place. In fact, I was talking to one senior Labour figure just the other day who was saying that they were sort of schooling a lot of their new backbenchers about how 2024 is the high point. From there on in, it involves losing things, but that doesn't necessarily equate to the world falling in on itself, nor does it equate to necessarily losing the next general election, but just a sort of as this older, wiser, as they might see it, soul schooling a new generation on what often happens with the ebbs and flows of the political tide, and the mood music I pick up amongst Labour folk as far as the elections next week are concerned is not wildly positive. Conservative perspective, they've done a fair amount of expectation management by saying that these elections are going to be absolutely cataclysmically bad. And there's plenty of indications that suggest that they will be pretty ropey for the Conservatives because, as Jane was saying, where they were last time round, and Matt was mentioning the vaccine bounce and all that kind of stuff, and then the kind of wash out of the general election last year. For the Liberal Democrats, again, similar but potentially sort of equal and opposite to at least a degree, them hoping to capitalise on areas where they did well at the general election, thinking of places like Oxfordshire and perhaps Shropshire and other places like that, places in the rural south of south of England. Who else have I? Reform bouncing along and thinking, look, one of the stories since the general election has been a trend growth rate in the Reform opinion poll numbers. Can they actually turn that into real votes in real ballot boxes in real elections, both in terms of how well they do, where they do well? Can they address the issue that they had at the general election, that their vote was pretty evenly scattered geographically, which equated to a good number of votes but not a huge number of seats? Can they turn that into something where their vote is more efficient, to use the kind of language that folk like Jane use about the distribution of votes? And with a keen eye in particular, as I say, on the by-election, the Lincolnshire mayoral election, Doncaster, Hull and East Yorkshire, as well as how they do in the projected national share. Greens hoping to capitalise on their breakthroughs in their parliamentary seats. Where else can they tap into resentment on the left with the government at Westminster? And have I missed anyone?
No, that was everyone.
That
That's the main parties.
That's the main parties.
I was going to say that was a tour de force.
Monster waving loonies, possibly.
Well, yeah, they are. I note in my research for next week that Screaming Lord Hope, who is is it Howling Lord Hope?
Alan
Yes.
Howling Lord Hope.
Yeah,
he lives near me.
Does he?
Yeah.
Why
He drinks
am
in
I
the
not
local
entirely
pub.
surprised by that?
In his outfit.
Often in his outfit, in his big hat.
He's
Yeah.
got a
It's
trademark,
well, yes, so he
trademark
is.
white suit, yeah.
Yeah.
He is contesting Runcorn, so there he will be.
And if you want to find out if there's elections in your area and who the candidates are and which party they're standing for, that's available on the BBC News
I just
website.
mentioned a candidate, haven't I?
It says here.
Well done.
Matt, I'm intrigued as a broadcaster with a daily political show on 5 Live, and you've got a member of a political party or a minister or a shadow minister or a party leader in front of you. How do you divvy up in your head covering the local elections and covering the national picture when you've got that person in front of you for a grilling?
Well, it's really hard because we know that these local elections are about who runs your county council or who is your mayor, and that is going to decide who fills the potholes, who runs your schools, who looks after social care, bit of transport and all of that. And the politicians know this. And it's obviously, if you're, I don't know, a shadow minister or front bencher or whatever, or party leader, and you're going on a national radio station, you can't talk about how you would deal with the potholes in Cambridgeshire versus Lincolnshire because they're different things in different places. So the whole thing is a little bit odd and false anyway. And it's also interesting just listening to people phoning into 5 Live, the number of people who do just say, I'm going to use this as a protest vote. That I am going to vote for X party or Y party because of that. One interesting thing I've picked up a little bit from, I was speaking to a Tory MP in Parliament this week, this idea that Kemi Badenoch is really, her message is, this is going to be terrible. We are going to do really badly, everybody, just so you know.
Yeah, she said that multiple times.
Multiple times. And it is true that the Tories are starting from a high baseline because of what happened 4 years ago and the vaccine bans. But it's also true that normally sitting governments do badly in local elections, and it's the opposition that does well. Kemi Badenoch's line, this MP was saying to me, Kemi Badenoch's line would make more sense if they were still in government. And it's government versus government. Now, Kemi Badenoch is in opposition, and the government's polling has gone down because governments do unpopular things. And so, actually, the first election in opposition should be when you're starting to make progress. Like William Hague won an extra 150 councillors in 1998 after that terrible result. So it's not a given that you go out of government and clearly she should be hoping for a bounce back. The big problem is reform.
So William Hague did really well in 1998. Our new Chancellor, I was chatting to him yesterday about this, actually, as you do.
Chancellor at University, not
yeah,
special.
sorry. Yeah, Chancellor.
Too many chancellors.
And I just coincidentally were talking to him about
the 1998 local elections.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because, think of what was happening in the Tory party 5 years before that, right? It was John Major, it was ERM, it was a complete crisis of sleaze. The Conservatives were in complete disarray. And so he was coming up from a low point, and Kemi Badenoch is coming down from a high point.
Which is why your point about this is a continuation of last year's politics.
Yes.
It's not the start of the new politics.
Exactly. And what's really tricky, and, I'm quite a visual person, and obviously we're chatting on a podcast, so I can't draw you a graph.
We're on YouTube now, so we are semi-visual.
But if I had a graph, I'd want to kind of, what we need to kind of remember is what's happened between 2021 and 2024, and then what's happened between 2024 and 2025, and how much is the last bit giving us any extra information in that comparison to 2021. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, no, totally. Even without the chart.
And what's happened? Thank you.
You can draw one if you own it at home.
So in your mind, imagine my graph, and it's what's happened since 2024 is that the Labour Party has lost support. And the tricky thing with these local elections is because they're starting from a low base, the key thing is they're not that they're going to lose, is that they're not going to gain. And so they're not going to gain nearly as much as they should be doing, even though they're the party in government. So they've lost a bit of support. The Tories, polling looked like it sort of did a little bump up and then went back down again. So no change there whatsoever. But of course, Reform has seen their support increase since last year. And then the question is, where are they taking voters from?
Well, and Chris, on Reform, now that Nigel Farage's party consistently kind of leads the opinion polls, and that's a trend now that we can observe over the last few months, does the way he gets treated, both by the media and his opponents, does that feel different from how he's been treated over the last few, decades?
Yes, I think it does in its own way, or at least it's beginning to. So he occupied, obviously, a central role in the kind of political narrative pre the Brexit years, during the Brexit years, and immediately afterwards. I think what's interesting now, particularly with this trend around the opinion polls, is this sense of them becoming, if we define it over the last year or so, or less than that, maybe the last 6, 7, 8, 9 months, this sort of, for now at least, permanent fixture amongst a trio of, UK-wide parties polling frequently in the 20-something percent alongside the Conservatives and Labour, often within, margin of error difference between each of them, but with Reform, in quite a few, with its nose ahead. So going back to what Jane was saying as we started the podcast, this is that, in many senses, that first big test of whether those numbers read across into actual votes, and then I think your question, Adam, will be asked again by people like me, people like us, more broadly, the kind of those of us in the business of reporting on, covering and politics. What is the proportionate amount of attention and coverage relative to a political party in the Liberal Democrats with many more times more MPs, 72 versus 4 or 5, but where Reform beat the Libs in the popular vote at the general election, and if they were to do well in the by-election, in the mayoral race, in a projected national share, etc., and they're able to credibly make the case, look, our opinion poll numbers are not just opinion poll numbers, look at these elections, then that's going to get interesting. And there's no doubt that how Reform are doing, even before these elections, they have long spooked the Conservatives. They are now uppermost in the conversations among senior Labour folk, and you hear the Liberal Democrats talking about them as well, not least because there is in the attention economy of political reporting, if you are a party like the Liberal Democrats and there is a noisy alternative to the big two called Reform, the likely outcome of that is the amount of attention and airspace and bandwidth for you as a party like the Lib Dems will be squeezed.
But Matt, we have to be honest that, okay, there's always this case made by political parties of like, we can build up a power base in local government and we will to show to people what happens when we run things, which then becomes a proxy for imagine us running the whole government. But actually, that's quite hard for us as journalists to report on because actually we're not going to these local authorities a lot. And the times that a local authority kind of crisis or a big thing hits the headlines, they're usually quite unique sets of circumstances that don't really read across to a sort of equivalent national government.
No, that is true. What councillors do is give you foot soldiers. That if you're an elected councillor, and this is where the Lib Dem, part of speaking to some of the Lib Dems, they recognise that part of their comeback in the last few years is because they rebuilt in local government. That post the coalition, when they went into coalition, they lost every single time they came out. I think they lost councillors. And then they went out of power. They lost almost all their MPs. And they built back because if you've got elected councillors, they've got to go out and knock on doors when the general, and you're just seen to be visible and you're doing things and people like you. And, and particularly the Lib Dem sort of, what was it Kebby Badenoch said, they're nice people and they'll fix the church roof or whatever. They actually took that as a badge of pride. That's what they do and they go out and do that. It'd be interesting to see if Reform, having been seen as this sort of one-man band around Nigel Farage, the thing he's never really managed to do with UKIP, briefly the Brexit Party, and up until now with Reform, is turn it into a proper party. And what they have been doing in the last 6-12 months is building that infrastructure, opening local branches, standing in all these elections. And then if they can become a sort of movement, if you've got a dozen councillors here and a dozen councillors there, they have a presence on local websites, the local Facebook groups, the newspapers and all that. And so you sort of, it doesn't matter to us, reporting national news, what's happening in the opposition groups, but it just creates this sense of, and I suppose the general election does this a bit as well. In the past, these smaller parties, is it a wasted vote voting for them? When we saw in the general election last year, Lib Dems did phenomenally well, Reform getting them for the first time, Greens having more MPs than ever before. That suddenly, it gives you permission to vote for these people. And them being on those councils does the same thing.
I think, just going back to this question of what's different now, though, for Reform, I think it's definitely this kind of the potential to have grassroots mobilisation and that structure. But it's also, as Chris was saying, the fundamental difference is that the two largest parties are being seen currently as no thank you very much. Now, in 2013, UKIP got the national equivalent vote, which is similar to the projected national share rate, another calculation, 22%. And in 2019, the Brexit Party topped the poll in the European Parliament elections. And I think I'm right in remembering that in 2014, UKIP also topped the poll in the local elections, or did very, very well.
And they always used to win the European elections.
Yeah. Not always, but
maybe
certainly
in
living in our memory, in kind of relevant memory. Yes, absolutely. Sorry. So you've got this. So they've been there before, and we've had this kind of story on those election nights or days after. Oh my gosh, UKIP have actually topped the poll here, and the Brexit Party have topped the poll here. That was 2019. Theresa May was still Prime Minister before Boris Johnson took over. The Tories were completely in the doldrums.
That's when we were told it's now multi-party politics, 5, 6, 7, 8 parties.
And then 2019,
Boris Johnson 6 months later gets a majority.
Yeah.
And it was the largest two-party vote that we'd, combined party vote that we'd seen for ages. But the big change now is that you've got, as Chris was saying, this kind of neck-and-neck situation in the opinion polls. And you've got two of the largest parties, one of which still hasn't done, there's no evidence yet to suggest that the Conservative brand is anywhere near kind of recovering or even being taken a second glance at seriously. And then you've got the Labour Party in government in a very difficult economic climate, taking, decisions in very, very bounded kind of choice sets, of not being able to do things that really people want them to be doing. So it is a different moment, I think, but both because of that kind of local infrastructure that Reform have invested in, but also that it's different now. Do we think that voters are going to go back to the two largest parties in the next general election? That's the big question.
And actually, it's worth mentioning on the Greens and the Lib Dems, if you add their vote share together, they're the other quarter in this three-way split. So everyone is sort of on 20 to 25%. It's just that sort of group to the left of the Labour Party is currently split between two parties. But that will play out in different parts of the country. Some people, if you want to go that way, it'll be Lib Dems. In other places, it will be Green.
And we're just going to end now, because we're getting to the end of this episode of Newscast, with a trademark voice note from a by-election car park from Alex Forsyth, because she's been in Runcorn and Helsby. Here she is.
Hello, it's Alex coming to you from a car park in Runcorn, because I've spent the past couple of days in Runcorn and Helsby, which is a constituency in the northwest of England. It is made up of Runcorn itself, which is a town on the banks of the River Mersey, and then there is a more rural part of the constituency, so a smaller town, lots of villages stretching down towards Chester. At the moment, there's a by-election taking place here. Now, it is happening because the former Labour MP Mike Amesbury resigned after he was convicted for assaulting a constituent. And this is a pretty important by-election because it's the first one since Labour took power. It is in a seat that Labour won pretty comfortably last July at the general election. So it is an important test for Labour. And they are being challenged by Reform UK, who came second here at last year's general election. And now, well, they've got this seat in their sights. So I've been out and about talking to people. I've been to a business park. I've been to a cafe, 2 cafes, in fact, a tropical fish specialist, a running club, although I didn't do any running, thankfully. And what is often the case in by-elections, and is the case in this one, is that it's a mixture of local issues and national issues that come up. So things like the state of the high street, the facilities for young people. There's an issue here around the tolls that people have to pay to cross a local bridge. Then there's things like the cost of living and housing and the NHS and immigration. And one thing that has really been coming up is that people say time and again that when it comes to elections, politicians make promises, but what they really want to see is those politicians delivering on them. Now, it's the last week of campaigning before polling day. I think it is fair to say that this is being fought pretty hard, this by-election. That may be a sign of the fact it is quite high stakes. And I should do the important bit. There are 15 candidates standing in total. The Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, the Green Party are all standing here. And of course, you can go on the BBC News website and get all of the details if you want to know more about this by-election that is happening in Runcorn and Helsby. But I shall say farewell from Runcorn, and I'll catch up with you all next time when I might see you in the studio. Bye.
Thank you to Alex. I've just realised how hard it is to say tropical fish specialist.
Ooh.
I think she's off for a third cafe now, Alex, presumably, and with her sort of neon tetras. How fun was I thinking about tropical fish? The most of that after she mentioned tropical neon tetras.
Is that your favourite tropical
It
fish?
is. It is.
All right, okay.
I just checked actually. I thought, is this a memory? It was my mind playing, tricks on me. But I'm sure there's a little tropical fish called a neon tetra.
There definitely is.
Isn't there, with a little strand of blue through it?
Yeah.
Feeling a whole spin-off newscast about tropical fish specialism.
I was a teenage subscriber to Accurist and Pondkeeper magazine.
Were you?
I was, yeah.
And I suppose actually the word cast, it's got fishing connotations, doesn't it?
Yeah, we weren't fishing them out. Only when they were dead.
Anyway, I think... Do you know what? I'm waiting for the day next Thursday when there's no mention of the elections at all, from the opening of polling till the end of the polls.
Yeah, we can talk about tropical fish.
Yeah, exactly. That's how we'll fill that time. But Newscast will be back with a special post-election kind of breaking newscast on the Friday morning at probably about 7 o'clock. When we'll at least have the by-election result to talk about.
And the Lincolnshire mayoral.
Well, there you go. Right, Jane, thank you.
Thank you.
Matt, thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, thank you for your fish knowledge and a bit of politics.
Thank you. And thank you to Jane for your fact-checking on neon tetras.
And Laura and Paddy will be back with your next episode of Newscast, unless there's breaking news in between. But thanks for listening to this one. Bye-bye.
Bye.